Killing Floor. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Jack Reacher had no reason to stop in Margrave, Georgia. The small, sleepy town barely registered on any map, and he certainly hadn't heard of it before. But when he stepped off the bus on a quiet, clouded morning, he was drawn by a nagging curiosity. Something about the name had sparked a memory from a conversation long forgotten. So he decided to spend a few hours wandering the town before catching the next bus out. The streets were eerily calm, the kind of quiet that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Reacher's instincts, honed through years of military service, told him that something was off. People avoided his gaze, hurried their steps, and seemed wary of the stranger in their midst. Still, he kept walking. As he passed by the diner on the corner of the main street, he noticed two police cruisers parked outside. It wasn't the police presence that unsettled him. It was the fact that the officers inside the cars were staring at him intensely. Reacher didn't like being watched. His body tensed as the door to the diner swung open and the officers emerged, their hands resting on their holsters. "You there?" the taller of the two officers called out, his southern accent thick and authoritative. "Mind answering a few questions?" Reacher paused. He could tell this wasn't a request. There was something more to this town, something dark simmering beneath its surface. His gut told him to walk away, but he ignored it. This was how trouble always started for him, an innocent moment that spiraled into something far worse. "What's this about?" Reacher asked, his voice calm but firm. "You fit a description," the officer replied. "Come with us." Reacher's muscles tensed, but he remained outwardly calm. He had been in situations like this before, too many to count. Something was wrong in this town, and now, it seemed, they had pulled him into whatever twisted game was being played. "Fit a description for what?" he asked, not moving an inch. The shorter cop, a stocky man with a shaved head, stepped closer. "We ain't asking twice, stranger." Reacher scanned the street. Empty. No witnesses. No help. He could take them both down, no question, but that would only make his situation worse. For now, the best option was to go along, to find out what exactly was happening in Margrave. With a slight nod, he gestured for them to lead the way. The officers exchanged a glance, seemingly surprised that he complied so easily. But Reacher had learned long ago that sometimes, the best way to fight was to wait for the right moment to strike. As they walked towards the police station, a shadow crept over Reacher's thoughts. This town wasn't just hiding secrets, it was hunting for someone. And somehow, without realizing it, he had just become the prime target. Are you hooked yet? Subscribe and share to find out where this dangerous journey leads Jack Reacher. The real mystery is only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Cell. The police station was a small, brick building on the outskirts of town, with bars on the windows and an air of neglect that clung to the walls like mildew. Reacher was led through the narrow hallway, past desks cluttered with papers and phones that didn't seem to ring. The officers stayed silent, exchanging occasional glances as they walked, their boots echoing ominously against the floor. "Right in here," the tall officer said, opening a door that led to a dimly lit room. It was a holding cell. Small, cold, and empty except for a steel bench bolted to the wall. Reacher stepped inside, his eyes scanning every detail, always evaluating, always calculating. The door clanged shut behind him, and the officers stood just outside, watching. There was no formal questioning, no reading of rights. This wasn't standard procedure, and that only confirmed Reacher's suspicions. They weren't holding him because they thought he was guilty of something. They were holding him because they wanted to keep him out of the way. "What's the charge?" Reacher asked, leaning casually against the wall. The short cop smirked, his eyes glinting with something almost like amusement. "You'll find out soon enough. Someone's on their way to see you." Reacher frowned. He had no connections in Margrave. No one should be coming for him. Unless they weren't after him at all. This was something bigger, and now, whether by mistake or design, he was tangled up in it. How about a name? Reacher pressed, keeping his voice calm. Who's coming? The officers exchanged a quick glance, but neither answered. Instead, they turned and walked away, leaving Reacher alone in the cell with nothing but the cold steel bench and his thoughts. Reacher sat down, his mind working through the possibilities. Was this town as innocent as it seemed on the surface? Or was it a front for something far more dangerous? The fact that no one had explained why he was being detained, or even what he was suspected of, only deepened his suspicion. He had stumbled into something, but what? Minutes ticked by. Then hours. Reacher kept track of time by the way the light shifted through the small window high on the wall. Whoever was coming to see him, they were taking their time. Maybe to make him nervous. If so, it wasn't working. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A new figure appeared at the door, silhouetted against the fluorescent lights. It was a man in a suit, clean-cut, professional, an outsider, just like Reacher. "You've caused quite a stir," the man said, stepping into the cell. His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "But I don't think you realize just how much trouble you're in." Reacher studied him for a moment, his instincts prickling. There was something off about this man, too. His polished exterior didn't match the rough edges of the town around him. "I'm not in trouble," Reacher replied, leaning back against the wall. "But it sounds like you are." The man's smile faltered for just a second before he composed himself. "You don't know what you've walked into. But you will soon." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Enjoy your stay in Margrave, Mr. Reacher. It might be your last." The door closed with a heavy thud, leaving Reacher once again in the silence of the cell. But this time, he knew the stakes were higher. He wasn't just a stranger passing through town anymore, he was a markman. Are you ready for the next twist in Reacher's path? Subscribe and share to unravel the deadly secrets lurking in Margrave. Things are only heating up. Chapter 3. The Puzzle Pieces. Reacher sat on the bench, his mind sharpening as the hours dragged on. He replayed every word the man in the suit had said, every gesture, every clue embedded in the cryptic warning. It was clear now, there was more to Margrave than just a sleepy town. Something hidden, something dangerous, and now they had put him right in the middle of it. He wasn't one to wait around. Reacher stood up and started pacing the cell, his eyes scanning the room for weaknesses. The bars on the windows were solid, and the door was reinforced steel. Escape wasn't going to be easy. But Reacher wasn't in a rush. He had learned patience during his years in the military, and he knew that soon enough, someone would slip. His mind wandered back to the officers who had arrested him. Their body language, their cold demeanor, it wasn't just standard hostility towards a stranger. They were following orders, but whose? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed again. This time, it wasn't the man in the suit. Reacher turned to the door as the taller officer from earlier entered, a keyring jangling in his hand. "You're free to go," the officer said, unlocking the cell. Reacher raised an eyebrow, but didn't move. Just like that. The officer's jaw tightened. Just like that. "Don't push your luck, stranger. You're not welcome here anymore." Reacher stepped forward, his eyes locked on the officer's face. "What changed?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking back down the hall, clearly eager to be done with him. Reacher followed, the tension thick between them. As they reached the front of the station, the officer handed him his things, his wallet, a few bills of cash, and the clothes he had been wearing when they arrested him. "Word of advice," the officer said, keeping his voice low as he handed over the last of Reacher's belongings. "Leave town. Now." Reacher met the officer's gaze, searching for a crack in his steely expression. "Or what?" The officer's lips thinned into a tight line. "You don't want to find out. Reacher turned and walked out of the station, stepping into the evening air. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He stood there for a moment, absorbing the uneasy calm that had settled over Margrave. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something. But Reacher wasn't leaving. Not yet. As he walked down the street, he noticed a small diner across the way, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. He crossed the street and pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly as he stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, just a waitress behind the counter and an old man sitting in a booth near the back. Reacher ordered a cup of coffee and took a seat near the window, his mind racing with possibilities. Someone in this town knew more than they were letting on. Someone had given the order to release him, but why? They weren't letting him off the hook. They were watching him, testing him, trying to figure out his next move. The waitress brought over his coffee, and as she set it down, her eyes darted nervously towards the window. Reacher followed her gaze and saw a car parked across the street. A black sedan, with two men inside. They weren't locals. Reacher's instincts kicked into high gear. Whoever they weren't here for a friendly chat. He downed the rest of his coffee in a single gulp, dropped some bills on the counter, and walked out the door. The men in the sedan didn't move as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Reacher could feel their eyes on him as he walked past, his hands clenched in his pockets. They weren't going to make the first move. That was fine with him. He turned the corner and disappeared into the alley, his heart steady, his mind focused. He knew the game was on. And in Margrave, that meant only one thing: someone was about to lose. Is your heart pounding yet? Subscribe and share to see how Reacher handles the hunters. The mystery in Margrave is only getting darker. Chapter 4. The shadows close in. Reacher moved through the alley with calculated precision, his footsteps silent against the gravel as he weaved through the maze of back streets behind the main drag of Margrave. He didn't bother looking back. He knew the men in the black sedan would follow. Whoever had sent them wouldn't be satisfied with just watching from a distance for long. He needed to control the situation. And that meant making the first move. The alley opened into a vacant lot behind an abandoned warehouse, the perfect place to confront them without drawing any attention. He slipped into the shadows, positioning himself behind a rusted dumpster that smelled of decay and neglect. The evening light had faded, plunging the town into darkness, with only a faint orange glow from distant streetlights casting eerie shapes on the walls around him. The minutes ticked by slowly. Then, the unmistakable hum of the sedan's engine reached his ears. Reacher crouched lower, his muscles tensing as the car came to a slow stop just at the mouth of the alley. He could hear their muffled conversation, followed by the sound of two doors opening and shutting. They were coming in on foot, smart. They didn't want to alert anyone to what was about to happen. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder as the two men walked deeper into the alley, their flashlights sweeping left and right, cutting through the dark. Reacher remained still, waiting for the perfect moment. He counted their steps, his heartbeat steady, his breathing calm. When they were just a few feet away, Reacher stepped out from behind the dumpster in a fluid motion. The first man barely had time to register what was happening before Reacher's fist connected with his jaw, sending him crumpling to the ground in an unconscious heap. The second man swung around, reaching for his gun, but Reacher was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the weapon dropped to the ground with a clatter. Reacher slammed the man against the brick wall, pinning him there with a forearm to his throat. "Who sent you?" His voice was low, cold, each word cutting through the night like a knife. The man choked, struggling against Reacher's grip, but the former military cop wasn't about to let him go. "You've got one chance," Reacher warned. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes darted around, desperate, but there was no escape. "I don't know," he gasped. "We were just hired to follow you, that's it. I swear." Reacher tightened his grip, his patience wearing thin. "Who?" I don't know. The man croaked again, his face turning red. Somebody local. We got the call this afternoon. Just told to watch you. Make sure you didn't leave town. Reacher's eyes narrowed. Why? The man's breath was coming in ragged gasps now, fear filling his eyes. I don't know, man. There's something going on, something big, but we weren't told the details. Just don't dig too deep. People who ask too many questions in Margrave, they don't last long. Reacher studied the man's face for a moment, then released him. The guy slumped to the ground, coughing and rubbing his neck, but Reacher was already moving. He knew the type, small-time thugs hired to do the dirty work for someone else. They were low on the food chain, with no real information. But this confirmed what he had suspected. Something big was happening here, and whoever was behind it was getting nervous. Reacher picked up the man's gun and ejected the magazine, tossing both pieces into a nearby storm drain. Go back to whoever hired you, he said over his shoulder as he walked away. Tell them I'm not going anywhere. As he disappeared into the night, Reacher knew one thing for sure. The town of Margrave had underestimated him. They thought they could scare him off, but all they had done was light a fire in him. Now, he was going to dig deeper, find out what they were hiding, and expose it all. Because Reacher didn't run. He hunted. Want to see how deep this conspiracy goes? Subscribe and share to find out how Reacher tears apart the secrets of Margrave. The game is far from over. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. The next morning, Reacher stood in front of Margrave's city hall. The town seemed quiet again, but that was just the surface. Beneath it, things were boiling. Whoever was in charge here had enough influence to put eyes on him the moment he stepped off the bus, send men to watch him, and likely do much worse if given the chance. But Reacher wasn't planning on waiting for them to come at him again. He was going to get to the bottom of it first. The building itself was modest, brick and white columns, with an air of small-town respectability that Reacher knew was a front. Somewhere inside was the key to whatever was happening here. And Reacher had a pretty good idea of where to start looking. He pushed through the doors, the cool air from inside washing over him. The receptionist barely looked up as he passed her desk, which suited him just fine. He moved through the hallways, his eyes scanning the placards next to the doors. Finally, he found the office he was looking for, Grover Teal, Chief of Police. Reacher paused at the door, listening. Voices, 2 men inside. He leaned closer. I don't care who he is, one voice said, anger seething beneath his words. If he keeps poking around, it's going to blow this whole thing wide open. Reacher's eyes narrowed. He couldn't place the first voice, but the second one was familiar. The man in the suit, the one who had come to the cell last night. So he was connected to the police after all. We'll handle it, the man in the suit replied. We've come too far to let some drifter get in the way. Just give the order. Reacher's hand tightened on the doorknob. They weren't just watching him, they were planning something far more serious. But now, he had names. Grover Teal. The man in the suit. They were at the center of whatever was happening here, and if Reacher played his cards right, he could tear it all apart before they even saw it coming. He stepped back from the door, his mind racing. There wasn't time to confront them now, not directly, at least. He needed more information first, and there was only one person in town who might know enough to help. A few minutes later, Reacher was standing in front of the diner from the previous night. He had noticed something in the waitress's nervous eyes when she had glanced at the black sedan, something that told him she knew more than she was letting on. And if she had answers, Reacher intended to get them. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside. The waitress, her name tag read Rosie, looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. Reacher walked over to the counter, his expression unreadable. You saw them last night, he said, cutting straight to the point. Rosie's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Reacher said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The men in the car. You knew what they were here for." Rosie glanced around nervously, her hands shaking as she wiped down the counter. "You should leave town," she whispered. "They don't like outsiders getting involved." Reacher leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "What are they hiding?" For a moment, Rosie looked like she might break. Her lips trembled, her eyes filled with fear. Then she shook her head, stepping back. "I can't, if they find out I talked to you." "They won't," Reacher said, his voice calm, steady. "But if you don't tell me, things are going to get a lot worse." Rosie hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It's the money. This town, it's all about the money." Reacher frowned. "What money?" Rosie swallowed hard, glancing around the empty diner again before she leaned in closer. "Counterfeiting. They're making fake bills, millions of them. The whole town's involved. The police, the mayor, everyone. And if you dig too deep, they'll bury you." Reacher felt a cold weight settle in his gut. Counterfeiting. That explained the fear, the tight control, the men watching his every move. This wasn't just a small-town conspiracy, this was organized crime on a massive scale. "Who's in charge?" Reacher asked. Rosie's face tightened with fear. "Grover Teal. But he's just a puppet. The real power, it's bigger than him. Bigger than all of them." Reacher's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. The counterfeit operation was larger than he'd imagined, and now they saw him as a threat. But that wasn't going to stop him. It never did. He pushed back from the counter, his expression hardening. "Thanks." Rosie's eyes were full of worry. "Please," she whispered. "Be careful." Reacher nodded, his mind already forming a plan. Careful wasn't in his nature. But deliberate? That was something else entirely. Think this secret is big? Just wait until Reacher confronts the ones pulling the strings. Subscribe and share to find out how deep the corruption goes. Chapter 6. The Final Play. The sun had barely set by the time Reacher made his move. Armed with the information Rosie had given him, he knew that walking into Margrave's police station again would be suicide. Grover Teal and his men were likely preparing for an ambush, but Reacher wasn't going to give them the chance. Instead, he had his sights set on the source of the counterfeit money, the hidden heart of the operation. He had noticed the warehouse district on the outskirts of town earlier, a collection of rundown buildings far from prying eyes. If the counterfeit operation was as big as Rosie suggested, they'd need a large, secluded space to keep things running. The warehouses were the perfect spot, and he was willing to bet that was where they were printing the fake bills. Moving quietly through the empty streets, Reacher approached the largest of the warehouses, keeping to the shadows. His instincts were on high alert, every sound and movement around him amplified in the silence of the night. He reached the back entrance of the warehouse and found the door ajar, just enough to suggest carelessness or a trap. Reacher stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. The space was massive, filled with machinery and stacks of crates that lined the walls. He moved cautiously, listening for any signs of life. Then, faint voices echoed from deeper inside. He crept closer, ducking behind a stack of crates as the conversation became clearer. "Shipment goes out tomorrow," one man said. "Teal's got the police covering the roads, so there won't be any issues." "Good," another voice replied. "We can't afford any delays. The feds are already sniffing around, and if they get wind of this, we're done." Reacher's eyes narrowed. He recognized the second voice, the man in the suit. He was here, overseeing the operation personally. This was his chance to take them down, but he needed to move carefully. There were at least 2 men, maybe more, and they'd be armed. As Reacher prepared to strike, the conversation took a sudden turn. "What about the drifter?" the first man asked. Reacher's grip tightened on the edge of the crate, his body tense. The man in the suit scoffed. He's not a problem anymore. Teal's got people watching him. If he tries anything, we'll deal with him like we do all the others. Reacher's jaw clenched. They were underestimating him, but that mistake was going to cost them. He waited until the men turned their backs, then moved quickly, silently closing the distance between them. The first man didn't even have time to react before Reacher knocked him out cold with a single blow to the back of the head. The man in the suit spun around, his hand going for the gun at his side, but Reacher was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting the gun from his hand before slamming him against the nearest crate. "You've been making a lot of noise about me," Reacher said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now, let's see how much you know." The man in the suit glared at him, but there was fear behind his eyes now. "You don't know what you're getting into," he spat. "This operation is bigger than you can imagine." "Then you'd better start explaining," Reacher said, tightening his grip. "Who's behind this?" The man grimaced, struggling to breathe. "It's not just Teal," he gasped. "There are people above him, powerful people. They've been running this operation for years, and they won't let anyone ruin it. Not you. Not the feds. No one." Reacher stared at him for a long moment, piecing together the final part of the puzzle. Whoever was behind this, they had been operating in the shadows for a long time, using the town as a front for their counterfeit operation. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, power, influence. But Reacher didn't care about that. He only cared about one thing: shutting them down. He released the man in the suit and stepped back. "You're done," Reacher said calmly. "It's over." The man's eyes flashed with panic. "You can't stop them," he sneered. "You think taking me down will change anything? There will always be someone else." "Not here," Reacher replied. "Not in Margrave." Before the man could respond, Reacher delivered a sharp blow to his temple, knocking him unconscious. He surveyed the room, making sure no one else was lurking in the shadows. With the counterfeit operation exposed and their key players neutralized, the only thing left to do was call in the feds. Margrave was going to be put under a microscope, and every dirty secret hidden in the town's back rooms would be dragged into the light. But Reacher wouldn't stick around to see it. As he walked out of the warehouse and into the cool night air, he felt the weight of the town's corruption lift off his shoulders. He had come to Margrave on a whim, a name from his past drawing him here. But now, he was ready to move on. The bus station was only a few miles away, and by morning, he'd be gone, just another drifter passing through. Reacher didn't need to stay to know the town would never be the same again. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.